So, some soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews, they seized Jesus and they bound him. And first they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest for that year. Now Caiaphas was the one that had counselled the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die for the people. So Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another disciple. Now the other disciple, he knew the high priest, and so he went into the courts of the high priest along with Jesus, while Peter stayed outside. Now the disciple who knew the high priest, he went out and found the woman who kept the gate, and they brought Peter in. And she said to him, "Were you not also one of his disciples?" And Peter said to her, "I was not." Now the servants and the officers had made a charcoal fire. Well, it was cold, and they were standing around warming themselves. Peter was with them, also standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered, "I have always spoken to the world openly, always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews gather. I have said nothing secretly. Why ask me what I said? Ask those who heard me what I said. They will tell you what I said." And one of the guards who was standing by punched Jesus, saying, "Is that any way to speak to the high priest?" And Jesus turned to him and said, "If I've said anything wrong, then bear witness to what I've said wrong. But if I've spoken right, why did you hit me?" And Annas had Jesus bound and took him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Peter was warming himself by the fire, and they said to him, "Were you not one of his disciples?" And he denied it, saying, No, I'm not." Yet one of the men there was a cousin of the man whose ear Peter had cut off. And he said to him, I saw you with him in the garden." And again Peter denied it. And at once the cock crowed. So they brought Jesus from Caiaphas' house to the praetorium. They did not go into the praetorium, for they did not want to defile themselves, so they may eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked them, "What accusations do you make against this man?" And they said, "Well, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have handed him over." And Pilate said, "Well, take him yourselves, judge him by your own law." And they said, "It is not lawful for us to put a man to death." They said this to fulfill the words Jesus had spoken, to show by what death he was to die. Then Pilate again entered the praetorium, and he called Jesus. He said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did someone say this to you about me?" And Pilate said, "Am I a Jew? Your whole nation, your chief priests, they have brought you to me. What have you done?" And Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my followers would have risen up and stopped the Jews from handing me over. But my kingdom is not from this world." "So you are a king," said Pilate. "You say I am a king. This is what I was born for. This is why I came into the world, so that I may bear witness to the truth. Anyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said, "So what is truth?" After he said this, Pilate went out again to the Jews, saying, "I find no crime in him. But you have a custom that I release to you one man at Passover. Is it your will that I release to you the King of the Jews?" And they shouted, saying, "No, not him, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a thief, a robber, a bandit. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him whipped. And the soldiers, they wove a crown of thorns, and they placed it on his head. And they dressed him in a purple robe and came up to him and worshipped him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And then they punched him with their fists. Pilate came out again to the Jews and said to them, "I am bringing him out to you, so that you may know that I find no crime in him." And Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said, "Behold, the man." And the chief priests and the officers, they shouted out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" But Pilate said, "Well, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no crime in him." And they said to Pilate, "There is a law, and by that law this man ought to die, for he has made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate heard these words, he was more afraid. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, and he said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" And Jesus made no reply. Pilate said, "Will you not speak with me? You do realize I have the power to release you, or the power to crucify you?" And Jesus said, "If you have any power over me, then it has been given to you from above. Therefore the one who handed me over to you, they bear the greater sin." And upon hearing this, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews, they cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are not a friend of Caesar. For anyone who sets himself up as a king sets himself against Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, and he sat himself down on the judgment seat, in a place known as the Pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And Pilate said, "Behold, your king." And they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said, "What? Would you have me crucify your king?" And then the chief priests said, "We have no king but Caesar." And then Pilate handed him over to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out carrying his own cross. And they took him to a place known as the Skull, which in Hebrew is Golgotha. And there they crucified him with two others, one on his left and one on his right, with Jesus in between the two. And Pilate had a sign made up which he placed on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Now many Jews saw it, for it was near the city where they crucified him. And the sign was written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And the chief priests said to Pilate, "Do not write King of the Jews, but rather he said he was the King of the Jews." And Pilate said to them, "What I have written, I have written." After they had crucified him, the soldiers divided his garments amongst themselves into 4 lots. And when they came to his tunic, because it was made of one piece, woven from top to bottom, they said, "Let us not tear it up and divide it amongst ourselves, but let us draw lots to see who gets it." And this was to fulfill the scriptures that says, "They divided my garments up amongst them, and for my clothing they drew lots." And so this is what the soldiers did. Now standing nearby was Jesus' mother and her sister, and Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother standing next to the disciple whom he loved, he said to his mother, "Mother, behold your son." And to the disciple he said, "Behold your mother." And from that hour he took her into his own home. Now, Jesus knew that it was finished. And so he said, to fulfill the scriptures, I thirst. And there was a bowl of vinegar nearby. They filled a sponge with vinegar and put it on hyssop and held it up to him. And when he had drunk from the sponge, Jesus said, it is finished. And he bowed his head. And he gave up his spirit.